Welcome to a course on learning about the basics about EL assessment and what you might be able to do with your students in your classroom based on being able to read this information on our assessment results for EL students, English learner students, also called in some districts multilingual learner students. Today, we're going to talk about three basic topics. The first thing that we're going to do is learn a little bit about the annual assessment that we give and how to read those scores. What do we do with that information when our students take that test? The second thing we're going to dig into is, now that I know the scores, what can I as a teacher, what does that tell me? What can my students do in the mainstream classroom? And finally, what strategies are going to be a best match based on where my students at with their English language proficiency? So let's dig in. The first thing to tell you about is the WIDA Consortium. So the WIDA Consortium stands for World Class Instructional Design and Assessment. It includes a number of states, as you can see here in yellow, as well as some territories and other governmental agencies. This consortium provides us with our annual assessment, our screener, English language development standards. They do lots of great research, and professional learning that's available on their online portal. The English language development standards are a little bit different than our typical sort of content standards than we're used to. WIDA sees that language is sort of everywhere in our instruction. It's in how we teach, it's how we expect students to respond. We're always expecting students to read, write, listen, and speak in our classrooms. Additionally, in the newest edition of the standards, WIDA recognizes that we're doing more with multimedia, more with online platforms than we've ever done. And so they did acknowledge that when listening and reading come together in an online environment, it might be called viewing, it might be interpreting that information. And the expressive opposite flip side of that, right, the reciprocal skill there is if we're actually creating some media, we might be writing and speaking. And so that would be called representing our ideas. So WIDA sees that there are 5 English language development main standards. The first one is the language that we use to communicate for social purposes and instructional purposes. So providing directions on how to do something in your classroom, that would be social and instructional language that you're using to tell them to explain something or describe something, right? English language development standard number 2 is the language of language arts. Standard 3 is the language of math. Standard 4 is the language of science, and standard 5 is the language of social studies. These are our main content areas in our classes. And we just want to recognize here that the way that we use language, the way that we use grammar, the way that we use different groups of nouns or verbs to describe things looks very different in our math class than it does in our language arts or our social studies class. So the way that we use language to perhaps describe the steps in an experiment in science is going to be very directive, right? It's going to be sort of step-by-step sequential language, which is very different than the language that we might use to describe how we felt about a poem that we read in language arts, for example. The other thing that I wanted to point out here is that when EL students have English language development coursework, what EL students need, what I often hear from teachers, is they just need more vocabulary. So I'm going to tell you a story about my friend. My friend is a gymnastics instructor, and she had a lot of students from who spoke Japanese at home in her class. And one of the things that her kids loved doing with her when they came to class was teaching her a new word. And so they would say word of the week, and then she would have to say the word. And then they would say definition, and she would have to provide the definition in English. And she said at the end of a year, I knew 52 Japanese words. I knew one for each week, but I still couldn't put together a sentence. So vocabulary is important. I like to think of it like building a house. So vocabulary is sort of like the brick. We need the bricks to build the house. We can't build the house without the bricks or the material, right? But just bricks alone, that's not enough. So that's actually language like at the word and phrase level. We can move up to there to the sentence level. What you'll see here is a wall. I've represented it with a wall. When we start to add the fillers, the determinants or the articles or all the other adjectives and pieces of language that make a whole sentence, at that sentence level, Again, might look different in science than it does in social studies, than it does in English language arts, right? But that sentence level grammar is also something that EL students, or sometimes called multilingual students, ML students, need to also learn about. So learning about perhaps even how their first language is different in how we construct grammatical constructions in English. For example, the one that I think all of us hear a lot is something like in English, we put the adjective first. I have a gray house. And in Spanish, we would say, I have a house gray, right? We put the adjective after the noun. And so just understanding, doing that sort of contrastive analysis and understanding how my first language might be different than English is an important phase here in this sentence level understanding of language. And then finally, we have the discourse level, and that's really language at the whole house level, right? We've built the whole house now with our analogy. So we need to make sure that we're well organized in our language. So again, if we're describing the steps in an experiment, that's going to be organized differently in how we would go about that experiment, perhaps than something that we would do in another content area, right? How the language connects from one to another, again, will be different from content area to content area, from purpose to purpose. And then how much information we have, just even in one, the density, even in one little sentence, will be very different from reading a recipe, perhaps in FACS class, right, to some of our other content areas. So when our EL students go with our EL teachers, we're hoping that they're working on all these dimensions of language, that we're at the word phrase level, at the sentence level, and at the discourse level, so that we're finding those appropriate registers. If we're talking to the principal in the hallway, that's perhaps a different about the game last night or something, right? That's perhaps a different conversation than if we're presenting to a school board something. So knowing that that register and that discourse level, that's all very important information. Okay, let's get on to reading a score report. So when you read an ACCESS score report, there's a few different things to look at. One of those things is the domains. So each assessment that we gives 4 different subtests. We do listening, speaking, reading, and writing. So our kids have an opportunity to do those receptive domains, right, of listening and reading, and then those expressive domains of speaking and writing. So the multiple choice items are on the receptive domains, and those are automatically scored by the computer. But the speaking and the writing, those are scored by raters in Chicago. So we have 3 people who look at those scores to determine what that score is going to be. The score ranges from a 1.0 to a 6.0. That's called a proficiency level. So a proficiency level really helps us understand how proficient is the student, how much support would they need in a mainstream classroom where the medium of instruction, the language of instruction is in English. So that's really what the proficiency level is telling us. How proficient is this student in English? How much support do they need? It's really socially constructed, like based on how students do on other things like state assessments and perhaps other interim assessments. That proficiency level has been equated out, okay? So what they also show you is a scale score. And a scale score would be like a Roush unit. So those of you who give the MAP test, you might be familiar like with more of a RIT scale, right? Or a scale score. And so that scale score is the same starting in 1st grade and all the way through 12th grade on the ACCESS. And you can show true growth on that scale score, whereas a proficiency level is going to expect each year that there's going to be more and more language expectation in that mainstream classroom. So the proficiency level is going to expect you to keep going up. It is possible for a student to grow just a little bit in their scale score. They can actually go backwards in their proficiency level. Now, that doesn't mean they didn't grow in language, but they didn't grow enough to meet the demands of the mainstream classroom at that next grade level. So it's really important that when we're having conversations about students and student growth, we're looking at all the different kinds of scores on a score report, and we're thinking about like, not only did they grow, but like, was it enough growth? The other thing that I want to point out here is the confidence band. So the confidence band is that little gray bar that you see, and you see some are small and others are large. The way that our test is set up is that we give students multiple opportunities in multiple content areas. They might have a math question and a social studies question. And we say, here's a level 1 question. Can you do it? Yes or no. Here's a level 2 question. Can you do it? Yes or no. And we kind of go through what's called folders within that topic area, within that content area. And then we go to a new content area and we kind of repeat that process. If a student consistently scores the same, no matter the content area, no matter within that domain, then we are pretty confident in that score. You will see a confidence band that's really small. We are confident that if they took this test again, they would score with right here in this range. If you see a really large confidence band, a really long gray bar on any of these tests, what that's telling you is, we're not sure. Sometimes a student got the level 2 question right. Sometimes they got it wrong. We're not quite sure. Are they a level 2? Are they a level 3? We're not sure. You'll see that confidence band of that scale score really be wide on that student. So it's just something to take into consideration, especially when we're reconsidering like, oh, this doesn't feel like a reflection of what the student knows and can do with language. I wonder. When you're having that wondering, looking at the confidence band can really give you the information you need to kind of make a determination. Was that a good day? Was that a good test day for my student? Finally, we have the composite scores. Now, the composite score that we use most often is the overall composite score. That score is made up of 15% each of listening and speaking and 35% each of reading and writing. The reason that reading and writing are weighted more heavily than listening and speaking is because probably within your classroom, you have more of an expectation around reading and writing in your classroom than you do listening and speaking. Might not be true for kindergarten or first grade, but as we get up through the grades, generally speaking, we ask students to do more with language, with reading and writing than we do with listening and speaking. And so that score, that overall score, is weighted accordingly so that that overall score can really be used to tell us things like, when is a student ready to exit the program? Do they have enough language, right? So this is called the ACCESS Student Score Report. You should have one of these for each of your students. I will have you pause the video and take a minute to go look for one of your students. And I want you to explore a few things. I want you to look at that proficiency level. So on that range of 1.0 to 6.0, where does your student fall for each of those subscores, listening, speaking, reading, and writing? Then look at that overall level. Where is your student scoring from 1.0 to 6.0, right? How does that relate to the exit criteria that we have? And then look at those confidence bands. Are we pretty sure that that would happen again if we gave that test again today? I'm going to have you to pause the video and go take a look at that before we move on. Welcome back. Next, we're going to look at the WIDA Screener report. So this one is just slightly different than the ACCESS test. The ACCESS test is given annually. So we give that every year. And we are required by law to give that every year to all EL students. The screener test is typically given when a new student comes in and we want to know, are they in the program or not? If they are in the program, about where is their proficiency level? On the screener test, there are way fewer items and it's much quicker to give. And so we're not as sure about that level. We can't tell the level to the nearest 10th like we can on ACCESS. So I'm going to go back one slide because I forgot to say one thing that's important. On ACCESS, you'll see a score from 1.0, 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, all the way up to 1.9, and then 2.0, and then we sort of start again. This test takes a long time to give, and so we're very confident in that proficiency level score to the nearest 10th on ACCESS. However, on the screener, on the WIDA screener, because it's such a snapshot, we're not as confident. So in this case, we just give the closest level. There's no tenths here. We don't mess with that. It's really just the straight level. Did you get the level 1 questions right? Yes, then maybe you're a level 2. Did you get a couple level 2 questions right? Yes, then you're a level 2 for sure. You got no level 3 questions right? You're not a level 3. Yep, we know you're a level 2. That's really how the test finds the level for the screener. There's not a whole big language sample to be able to really hone in on what exactly is that proficiency level. So they're reported by domain, same domains, listening, speaking, reading, writing, same as ACCESS, but they're in those whole numbers in those proficiency levels. We also don't get a lot of information about scale score. Again, we're just not sure where they would fall. So there's no scale scores and there's no confidence bands on the screener because we're just trying to see, are you in the program? Yes or no? If you're in the program, about what are your needs? So we're really just looking at these proficiency levels and perhaps that overall composite score to say, if you're level 3, what kind of supports do we have in place for level 3 students? This would be a good time to pause the video. If you have any students that came into your district, maybe mid-year, they didn't come from another WIDA state, so we don't have an out-of-state access test for them. We had to sort of screen them when they came to make sure that they qualify for the program. So pause the video and take a look at your screener results if you have some of those in front of you. In your notes catcher, I have just a couple of activities. Again, you can pause the video and see if you can fill in what percentage of that overall composite score are listening, speaking, reading, and writing, and then see if you can do the matching activity in the packet as well in that notes catcher. So that's on page 1 of the notes catcher. See if you can match the definition to the type of score. It should take you about a minute or so. Here are the results. So 15% each of listening and speaking and 35% each of reading and writing. That's the overall composite score. And a composite score is a single score that represents a combination of other scores. A scale score is that raw score that's converted into a consistent and standardized scale. And then that proficiency level is that socially constructed representation of what a student can do in a classroom situation. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of information about that student score. You can start to meet this objective, right? Hopefully now you can sort of analyze and interpret the English language proficiency scores for your current EL students. This is something that I would have you do at the beginning of every school year or the beginning of every semester as you get new students. It's important to know where those students are at. All right, we're going to move on to the next section. This one has some activities in your packet, so it's going to be less of me speaking and more of you working. The Can Do Descriptors are a really great resource for teachers, especially the general Can Do Descriptors. They're the kind of original ones that I like to use. They have them split up into different grade levels. So pre-K and K are together, and then 1st and 2nd grade are together. 3rd through 5th is together, 6th through 8th, and then 9th through 12. And they have the scores broken down. The descriptors are broken down in those same areas: listening, speaking, reading, and writing. So I want to do a little activity with you. First, I want to tell you a little bit of a story. When I was in a district, what I noticed is that when teachers got a new EL student, they were really unsure of what to do. And it kind of ended up in one of 2 ways. That unsure, not wanting to put additional pressure on this new student coming in who was just learning language. Sometimes that created a situation where the student was kind of parked in the room somewhere, maybe coloring, working on an iPad, not really participating with the class. The teacher sort of felt bad for that student, like, oh, I don't know what they can do. I don't want to have too high of expectations. So they really didn't have any expectations at all. On the flip side, I also had some teachers in district who were like, in my class, we do 80 terms every chapter of this high school class, whatever it is, right? And it doesn't matter if they're EL or not, like this is what the expectation is. And so I remember thinking at the time, there has to be something in between, right? Those are 2 very ends of a continuum, right? There's a lot of space in between. How do we know what students can do and what's in between? So the Can Do Descriptors are a really great resource to help us think about that. So based on my student being a level 1 in listening, what can my students do? I really like how this is assets-based. WIDA is really great about assets-based language and helping us think about what can the student do and grading them based on that versus grading a student on what they can't do. We know that EL students can't do all the things in English that their mainstream counterparts can. They wouldn't be in the program if they could, right? And so really being more equitable and thinking about how to more fairly grade students and how to have a reasonable expectation based on their proficiency level is a really great first step in including students in your instruction. So I'm going to have you do a little bit of an activity. You're going to be pausing the video here. The first thing I'm going to have you take about 5 minutes to do is locate the grade band that you work with most often in your notes catcher. So these are on pages 2 and 3. And I've got a little bit of a fill in the blank activity. So I'm going to have you work with a partner if you can, and try to fill in those words that help describe the action of language or the function of language within those can-do descriptors. So see if you can fill in those words based on the different proficiency levels for the grade level that you're working with. So read through those items, read through the modality, listening, speaking, reading, and writing, and see if you can fill those items in the word bank. Pause the video and take a minute to do that now. The next step that we're going to do is check your answers. So keep moving along in your notes catcher and you will see a completed version of the can-do descriptors, and you can check your answers. See how close you are to kind of looking at that a little more in depth. Now, the purpose here isn't for you to have the can-do descriptors memorized. I really want to just familiarize you with this resource so that you use it to think about what your students are able to do in your classroom. As you come back from that activity, the next thing we're going to do is I want you to take out your student and that access score you were looking at earlier. Perhaps it's a screener test, perhaps it's an access test. I want you to look at the domain level proficiency scores. And what you can do is you can highlight or circle on your notes catcher the place where your students fall. So for example, if you have a student who's level 2 in listening, I want you to find that page on your notes catcher, find the right grade level, and circle the box where it says level 2 listening. Then move it to the speaking score. Perhaps they're a level 1 in speaking. Circle the level 1 box. Really take a look at that and think about what can I reasonably expect my student to do in my classroom given their proficiency level and the can-do descriptors. If you're working with a partner, use assets-based language to tell your partner what your student is able to do in your classroom. So again, focusing on what they can do, not what they can't do. One thing to consider is the time of year that you're doing this training. So we give access in usually February of every year. We get the results back in May, right before we leave for the summer. So if you're doing this training perhaps in December, your access results might be almost a year old. So you can also be thinking forward about hopefully your student has grown about a level since then. And you can be looking at that next box over as well to say, now what can I reasonably expect my student to be able to do? If you're doing this training at the beginning of the school year, your results are fresh and you can circle that box and know confidently that that's about where they're at in their language proficiency. I'm going to have you pause the video and take a minute to do that activity. Coming back, it looks like we've got 2 things checked off our agenda. We have one final thing to take a look at, and that is the go-to strategies document. So now we know how to read the assessment results. We know what that means. We've got the can-do descriptors to say, okay, what does that mean the student can do in my classroom? Now we need to say, like, so what? So what am I going to do as the teacher? So we also have a resource that helps us with that, and that's called the go-to strategies. The materials for the go-to strategies are also in the course. It is a PDF document that's about 100 pages long, so it's probably not something you're going to want to print. I did put one page in your notes catcher as a quick guide, so you can take a look there. And then I'll also pull it up so that you can see it on my screen in just a second. The can-do descriptors are organized a few different ways. They do have levels 1 through 6 represented, and they have those same areas of listening, speaking, reading, and writing in the document. They have the strategies organized in the document around 6 types of strategies. The first type of strategy is the community building strategy. Next is interactive strategies. The next is teaching strategies and student learning strategies, then vocabulary, reading, and writing. Okay. This is going to take you a few minutes, but what I'd like you to go do next, I'm going to show you one thing. In this PDF, what you will see is for each strategy listed, you see all 6 levels, and there are gray boxes. If the boxes are gray, then that means it's a good strategy for those levels. So you could see varied grouping formats is a good strategy no matter what proficiency level. When we go to video observation guides, it's probably not yet a good strategy for levels 1 and 2. Those students may not have enough language yet to be able to do that strategy at levels 1 and 2, but it's a great strategy for levels 3, 4, and 5. So that's how you use this guide. I'm going to give you some time now to follow these instructions and use this document to match up to your student. So let's say your student, remember, was I think we said they were a listening level 2 and a speaking level 1. Let's say they're an overall level 2 student. We would be looking in this document now for a strategy that would be good for level 2 students. Also a strategy that matches what I'm trying to do with my activity and my instruction. So here's a great one. An idea map or a concept map is a great strategy for a level 2 student. However, I wouldn't pick Cornell Notes yet. That level 2 student likely does not have the language yet to be able to really do well with Cornell Notes. Okay, and if I look through this document, I see a closed sort would be another great vocabulary strategy for my level 2 student. So use the overall proficiency level from the ACCESS test or the screening results and do this activity that I have. I'll put it back on the screen. You don't need to Google it. We'll put it right in the course for you, but open up the PDF, the 100-page PDF of the go-to strategies. Look for some strategies that you're interested in and try to match up those strategies with the needs of your student. As an additional activity, if you're working with a partner, it'd be really great to do a jigsaw activity and talk to each other about the strategy that you want to try in your classroom. I'm going to let you pause the video and give you about 5 minutes to do that activity. Thanks for coming back. The last step in our course is to make an action plan. So I want you to take what you learned today and make an action plan. First, we have to make sure we've met all our objectives, don't we? So finally, we've explored the go-to strategies document and we've aligned that with the levels of students that are in our class. So last is our action planning. This is the last page, page 10 of your packet. And I want you to think about how to use this information, maybe today, maybe tomorrow in your classroom. So what's an action you could take? Why is it important? You know what is best about goal setting is if you share your goal with a partner, you're much more accountable to it. So if you are working with colleagues or a partner, it would be a great idea to fill this in and maybe have them take a little picture of it. Maybe set a little note on your calendar and check in on each other next week and see how it went. Thanks so much. I hope you learned something. I hope these resources are helpful to you. Please let me know if you have additional questions.